It is not accidental, therefore, that the human being is first and foremost homo adorans. It's a worshipping creature. It's made to worship and to carry in its worship and present before God the totality of creation, both the visible and the invisible, both heaven and earth, joining in worship in humanity. So, we can think, therefore, about all of creation also further, not only as a grand liturgy, but as a grand Eucharist. And let's think for a moment about time as perhaps the first created work of God. God creates time and then spreads on the canvas of time everything else that is the material aspect of the cosmos. So we see in the beginning in Genesis a sequence of 6 days in which God works and speaks forth creation and brings it forth into existence. And then a 7th day of rest, the Sabbath of God. And that sequence consequently of 6 days and of work followed by 1 day of rest marks all of time, as time appears as ordered sequence of weeks. So therefore, all human activity that consequently takes place as 6 days of work as worship and 1 day of rest as worship is consecrated. It is marked as a continual, perpetual divine liturgy in the presence of God. So, in view of that, creation, all of matter in that cathedral that the cosmos, the universe represent, functions as means of communion between humanity and God and one human being and their fellow human. So therefore, creation is meant to be shared. Creation is not meant to be domesticated for one's own particular use. It is meant to be shared, and therefore it's more than enough only when it is shared. When it is not shared, we have conditions of scarcity, right? Okay, then we compete for creation, and creation is never enough because it has an Eucharistic essence, and it has an inherent pedagogy. God is teaching us to live as an image of Himself, of the divine communal life, in which life is shared and not privatized for just one of the 3 persons of the Trinity. And humanity's priestly vocation, therefore, in the world also has to do with humanity's creative activity as an extension of that imaging of God, right? So humanity is placed in Eden, in the Garden of Eden, which is perhaps the first sanctuary, God-made sanctuary that we see in the cosmos, God-carved sanctuary where God dwells with his creatures and with humanity, where the human being interacts with God face to face. So it is in a sense the proto-holy of holies, but humanity is given a mandate to extend with its creative activity that Eden, that paradise, that proto-holy of holies to the uttermost parts of the earth, until the entire earth becomes a paradise, until the entire earth becomes a sanctuary, the entire earth becomes a holy of holies, the entire earth becomes a church, full to its limits with the divine presence. The entire earth becomes saturated with worship to God. Okay, so human vocation as imaging of the Trinitarian life in the material world, in view of all that we have said so far, and this is just scratching the surface here in 10 minutes, has to be marked by a harmonious, representing a harmonious community of difference or otherness in unity. Community of justice and shalom as access to life and flourishing for all. As ascesis and kenosis, which is part of how we see God in the act of creation. Ascesis, as we said already, making space for the other, for the different, for their needs, so that they may be and they may flourish. Kenosis, putting ourselves on behalf of the other. Investing ourselves on behalf of the other. And this is precisely what God does in the divine creative act. As we said, create space within himself for the flourishing of the other, sustaining the other so that they may be and live life more abundant, but also the other comes forth as an outcome of the divine self-pouring, right? Okay, as a grand gesture of hospitality to the other, not demanding that they become like us, so that they may abide in our space or in our domain. As prayer, that an intercession on behalf of the other and the rest of the world, so that we carry in a godlike manner, we carry the world in ourselves, in our concerns for the world, in our longings for the world, in our desires for the world, in our hopes for the world. We carry before God the entire world and our fellow humans and the rest of creation as care for all of God's creation, because as Saint Irenaeus says, the glory of God is every creature fully alive. Okay, so of course Christ is the prototype and telos of all of that human vocation and human endeavor, and that imaging of the Trinitarian communal life on earth. Becoming like God is becoming like Christ, because Christ is God in flesh, right? Okay, so some practical communal commitments then that are an extension of that vocation, that are an expression of that vocation, and that also are reflected in our core values. Recognizing the interconnectivity of all humanity and the rest of creation, and therefore recognizing that our well-being is a function of the well-being of others and of our environment, of the rest of creation. Reverent consumption, therefore, and faithful stewardship, living in a way that does not jeopardize the ability of others to meet their basic needs and to flourish as well. Differentiation, therefore, between our needs and desires, bringing our needs and desires to the altar, laying them before God, consecrating and sanctifying our needs and desires, reordering, therefore, our desires, our affections as an act of worship to God, and consecrating all of our life as a perpetual worship to Him. Presenting our time, talents, professional skills as offering to God towards His redemptive purposes for creation, towards His ongoing activity of mending the world. Okay, and there we go, the Lee University's core values, the responsible citizenship, both local and global, because we are trying to form a community of justice that is capable of thinking globally and acting locally in a way that brings about the flourishing of all humanity and creation. Ethical action that recognizes the sacredness of life in all of its locations, that commits to human flourishing. Redemptive service that is a form of ethical action which doesn't target just meeting the immediate needs of the other in benevolent offerings to them, but also is seeking to eradicate systemic evils that cause injustice in the world. So it is a commitment towards the formation of a community of justice. This is what our core values are about, and doing so as an act of worship to God. So therefore, in conclusion, Christian higher education can be viewed as a sacrament for the life of the world, as a realm for an encounter with God that transforms us into His likeness. The life of the Christian university, with its distinct rhythms, is therefore an intentional liturgy that shapes communal time and space into a sanctuary, and everyday activities of learning and living together into unceasing worship to God. And therefore it becomes an instrument in God's hands for carving a community of justice and virtue, something that Aaron will be talking to you about, as an act of world mending and healing of creation that starts with the healing of the human community. The healing of God's world starts with the healing of the human community. Heaven starts with the new humanity. And what we are doing here, we are cultivating, shaping, molding as instruments in God's hand this new humanity, one life at a time. This is what we are doing. And so therefore, Christian higher education is a socio-transformative endeavor through intentional, communal Christian formation, because that telos that is looming on the horizon behind all of this endeavor is Christ himself. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. All right. Okay, Aaron, let's see.
Let's see how I do.
No, I mean, it doesn't have a clip, so.
Hello. Testing. Yeah, you guys can't hear it, only the camera can. I hope that this is working. Okay. It's a little hard to follow up on that because Daniela is basically painting what we're supposed to be about in a cosmic sort of framework. And I'm a very small sort of person in that larger cosmos. And so I want to just start with sort of, what I think my goal is here today. So you guys are supposed to be new faculty. I'm relatively new. Some of you have never taught before. Some of you have taught before, just not here. Some of you have taught before, but not at a Christian university or in a Christian context, etc. So I would just like to say, I went to a Christian undergraduate university. I then went to secular schools for my master's and PhD. I taught at schools that had a Christian tradition but were otherwise not intentionally Christian, the way that Lee University is. And then I taught at a fully secular university before I came here at University of Chicago. And I had never been forced to reflect deeply upon what it meant for me to be a Christian scholar and for me to be a Christian teacher, for me to be a Christian scholar teacher. I had, of course, thought about how to, how does one integrate faith and learning and things like that. Any thinking Christian, I think, does this in whatever field they go into. So I had thought about these sorts of things. But one of the very juicy opportunities that is given every single day at Lee University and then throughout the summer is to be able to think very intentionally in a community of very thoughtful, reflective Christians about what it means to do what we do as Christian professors, as Christian intellectuals, as Christian teachers, etc. And so I'm still piecing together, and I actually feel I've come to these sort of moments of illumination over the last 6 years that are actually embarrassing, because I had taught 10 years before I came here, and I thought I was a pretty decent teacher. I was getting decent evaluations, I was getting good reviews on scholarship and things like that. And they're very embarrassing when I come here, and then I feel dwarfed by an intellect like hers. And so anyway, so there's some things that I think have been very interesting that I've sort of stumbled into over the last 5 or 6 years in regards to what it means to teach at a Christian university. What is this project that we think we're about? What are some of the, I think, exciting ways that we can go about trying to practice doing this? And it's going to be a bit more grounded, a bit less cosmic. It ties in actually nicely. Danielle and I have had conversations now for the past we came here at the same time 6 years ago. We have had conversations back and forth, and I actually disagree with some parts of what she said, and that's actually sort of the fun of doing this. But in any case, one of the things that was embarrassingly late in coming into my recognition was what teaching was actually, what is at the heart of teaching, and if I could define it in a single sentence. And I had always been taking for granted the possibility that teaching is the passing on of information at the highest level that I could. So that would be excellent teaching, would be passing on this information, doing it in a way that was understandable, engaging to the person, could then be remembered well, could be applied in various instances, etc. And it was an education that was based upon the passing on of information. And I came across some Christian pedagogical theorists, I could say, and it's not distinctively Christian, but they were saying, in fact, there's a heck of a lot more that goes on in a good, true, proper education, and that is not just the passing on of information, but it is about the formation of people. And especially at a Christian university, I find this to actually be mildly exhilarating. I mean, you can't be exhilarated and mild, but I found it to be, that's an odd way to try to phrase that. So anyway, I found it to be rather exhilarating, though, to say, okay, this is actually something much more holistic. This is something much more beyond learning. I teach dead languages. I teach Greek and Latin. It's not just teaching dead things and dead languages written by dead people to people who are students who are no doubt going to continue to kill it if it's not dead yet. And this is sort of the joke, right? This is the sort of joke I have with Latin. Listen, you all think it's a dead language. Well, if it's not dead, I'm sure by the end of the semester it will certainly be, you will have killed it. So it was more than that. It was more than just doing that. It's actually embracing a heck of a lot more of who I am. And at a Christian university, I can literally think out loud in the classroom about what it means for me to be a Christian, thinking about these sorts of authors or literature, the philosophy that I'm reading from antiquity. And also these students are bringing their whole lives into this. They are living in community on campus or off of campus, but they're being hopefully wrapped into something a heck of a lot larger than just the mere lecturing and passing on of information to these sorts of students. So, well, what does this mean then? So what does it mean if Christian education or education in general is about forming a person? I had never asked this. In 10 years of teaching, I had never asked, what is it, what sort of people do I want at the end of the 4 years or 5 years or however long it takes to get these poor souls through the university education? What sort of person am I looking for at the end? What sort of character do I hope they have? And I'd never asked that. I'd merely said, I want them to know Greek and Latin as dang well as they possibly can so they don't embarrass me when they go off to graduate school or when, they are asked to come up with a motto or something like this, some cheesy thing that people always ask people who teach Greek and Latin, can you come up with a motto for something silly? Which usually has no direct equivalent in the language anyway, and so it always leaves me scratching my head. So, I mean, that had been the limits of what I was doing, and then basically doing sort of a very self-centered sort of project, which was, this is a really fun hobby for me, and I like it, and I'm getting paid to do this, and this is a blessing to be paid to do this. But, so, I began asking this question, what sort of student do I want? I mean, what sort of person is being shaped in all of this process? And I reflected back on my own undergraduate education at a Christian university. In fact, I was shaped in all sorts of life-changing ways that set me off in a path that I never dreamed of in the blue-collar home in which I'm the only kid in my family to go to college, etc. I mean, I have gone places and I have thought thoughts and I inhabit a different imaginary universe than I ever thought was impossible to inhabit, and that's the sort of thing I live in. And that's going to shape the choices I make and the actions I have and the things that I prioritize and all of these sorts of things that I sometimes take for granted and I do at a subconscious or unintentional sort of level. These were all things that were being shaped in various ways by professors and by friends and by lectures I heard and guest lectures and debates and staying up late at night at a coffee shop in downtown Denver because that's where I'd done my schooling. And haggling and then buying a used book that totally changed my thinking about something. So it was all these sorts of little sorts of things. So what does it mean for me now that I'm on the other end and the professor teacher sort of end? What is it that I'm doing? And so I actually go back to something from my blue collar days. My dad is a drywall construction worker, and he taught me as a kid how to do drywall. Now you can't, most of you don't even know what this is, but this is taking care of walls in a house or a building to make it fit so you can paint it and then live in it. And so he got me learning how to mix drywall mud and how to spot nails and things like this when I was 5 years old, and I'd get paid a nickel per nail that I spotted, and if I did it right, I get drywall mud all over myself and things like this. You learn how to hold the pan, and you learn how to hold the knife, and you learn the thickness of the mud and all these sorts of things. How did he teach me these sorts of things? I mean, part of it was he dragged me over to the drywall bucket, had me hold the drill, just shaking my little 5-year-old body, and you'd pick it up and okay, it's too thick. Let's add more water, etc. And it's this sort of hands-on standing over me I'm going to lose it too, even though I'm sitting here. It's the sort of hands-on, standing over me, having me pick it up, no, you put too much on, all these sorts of things, eyeballing sorts of dents in a wall. What do you do when a wall is cockeyed and it's not quite the same way that the last one was that you worked on? What sorts of things do you look for, and what sorts of problems are you going to have, and what sort of tools are you going to need? And it was gaining a certain sort of vision, as well as a certain sort of way to balance myself and hold myself and things like, and what if you're hanging it on the ceiling? I mean, this is an art form. It really is. So he was doing all of that sort of thing, and I began to think, this is actually a heck of a lot like teaching dead languages too. I mean, it seems like a stretch, but it's actually not. I am working with students and saying, well, how do we find out the range of meanings for a word? Or how do we find out the ways in which what we call syntax? How do we find out the ways in which words work together?
Too loud, too soft, where's your pedal? I mean, all these sorts of questions that isn't just the passing on of information. It wasn't just saying, when you see a note on that line, that's the E or whatever. It's a heck of a lot more. And so I think that's sort of, so what I would like to pass on to you is something that is embarrassing to me that I came too late. Chances are you guys all know this already, but maybe make it a little bit more intentional. So I would just encourage you, as new faculty, at least here at Lee, if you haven't been intentional about this, this is the sort of thing to be intentional about. How is it that I'm going about this process of formation? And no, I'm not all that. In fact, I'm not the only one forming the student. God is forming the student. I've got my little finger in the, shape in the pot, and that's about it. But it's an important finger to have, nonetheless. I mean, if we look back at our own, teachers that made us who we are today, we will look back and we will say, look, these people have actually had a profound impact. Some of them will never know. I mean, the reason I'm a professor today is because of a professor, but I have never gone back and told him, you're the reason that I've gone off in this way. He wouldn't even remember me. I sat in the back row with a baseball cap down, slouched down, loving every minute of class, and he will never know. So we just don't know what little sorts of contributions we might be making.
But there's also intellectual virtues, and I think that they are not just entirely parallel. I think they entangle themselves with each other in interesting sorts of ways. But I have become much more intentional in my classes of asking myself, even if I never say it out loud, and sometimes I do, and it actually helps engage students in classes they don't want to be in, like core classes, is saying, the larger purposes of this course is not so that you will, know your Greek mythology, or you will know your dead authors, or I will have thrown out a handful of Greek words that were important for interpreting that text, when you have no motivation to learn this beyond jumping through a hoop to get a piece of paper, to get a job at the, get your diploma at the end, and hopefully you're going to get this great job. I say, in fact, for whatever reason, before I ever came here, there's administration, there was other people that said, we want a certain sort of person in this. And so I do sometimes ask the students, but I'm always asking myself, what sorts of intellectual virtues do I want to inculcate beyond the information, or beyond the reading comprehension, or beyond the interpretive possibilities for a particular text? What sorts of intellectual virtues do I want to be a part of shaping in this student's life? I'm not the only one, but what sorts of ones do I want to contribute to? Like patience, or attentiveness, or diligence, or generosity. I mean, these are intellectual virtues, not just moral virtues. How does one intellectually be generous towards somebody who's arguing another position that you think is clearly wrong, etc.? How does one engage in intellectual justice and fairness? I mean, I think these are very interesting questions. They drive my field of classics in very important and sometimes insidious and sad sorts of ways, because people actually didn't allow their character to be shaped, because they were in fact formed by a research university that was telling them information is the only thing that matters. And so in fact they allowed all sorts of other forces to shape their character in, I think, rather unfortunate ways. Virtues of humility, etc. So, I mean, there's all sorts of these interesting sorts of virtues. So I would just encourage you. So I see my task as, right now today, is just to tell you, I would encourage you, you are at a place with lots of professors who are very intentionally asking these sorts of questions. And if they're not, shame on them, right? I mean, hopefully we get them to be part of what it means to be at a Christian university. I think that's a big part, at least for me, of what it means to be at a Christian university, is to have a community of scholars and a community of teachers, a community of students who can be asking these questions in holistic sorts of ways. When I was at University of Chicago, I felt like, I would be reading Plato with students. We're talking about the nature of God, for instance, in this pagan philosopher living, in the 4th century BC. And I felt like I walk up with the students to an edge, and then of course I don't cross it, because we all know, chances are, it's me and maybe one other person who even believe in God in this room. And so it was sort of unfortunate. I had some of the, it's a very competitive school. I had really good, really students that challenged me intellectually. But I always found it sad that I can only walk up to this edge, and then there's sort of this invisible boundary that I want to cross and can't, because it's just the inappropriate place and we don't share a common vision. So this is a place, what I love about Lee is it's a place to bring holistically all that I am as a Christian, as an intellectual, as a child and a father and a husband, and everything that I am, I bring to the task of teaching. And I can ask these sorts of questions, no holds barred. What do I do as a Christian now? I've been taught this, I've been thinking this, I've been in this channel. Is this really the way I should be going, etc.? And what are the virtues that I want to be, do I want myself to be formed by, as well as be part of the formation in the lives of my students? So anyway, I would just encourage you to be intentional about that. In the first year of teaching, Lee is a really hard place to try to juggle everything. If you're having an experience anything like mine, it was a very heavy teaching load. They want me to run around with students all afternoon, and then I'm supposed to be thinking about God in the midst of it when I'm very flustered and things like this. But long term, be thinking this is the place to explore these sorts of issues in ways that I think are really exciting and I think terribly meaningful. In any case, so I'm going to pass it on to you.
Something like that.
Something.
You might wonder why a composer should be included on this panel. I wonder it myself. Maybe for comic relief, except I don't really have a sense of humor, so it's not that. It might be because maybe I'm the only one that actually has training in one of the original liberal arts, which is music, and the others are just sort of meta. Instead of meta. No, I think actually probably it's because it really demonstrates the fact that these ideas, these really big ideas, are not the purview of, say, humanities or theology. In fact, it's the approach to every part of this campus, whether it's something as like the School of Music, which some people say, well, that's sort of, if it's sort of conservatory style, what does that have to do with any of this stuff? It's just training pure and simple. But it's not. We're part of the Christian picture here. School of Nursing, same deal. It's not a separate thing. So these ideas pervade the entire university, not just, say, humanities or something. I'm going to begin by complaining against two phrases that are typical for institutions like this. And the first is integration of faith and learning. It's a phrase that's used frequently. I don't like that phrase. I think it already gives up the problem entirely to the wrong side. I think it assumes that learning and faith can somehow be considered separate and then somehow integrated. In the shallowest view, it would seem to suggest that you could have sort of learning or education and somehow download the faith app and you've got a Christian education. Or maybe a little bit better, the integration suggests maybe stronger, so it's more like coffee, where you can pour in cream and if you give it a good stir, it's really integrated. That maybe that's what's meant, that if you take a good education and if you do a very good job of permeating it with Christianity, then you have an integration of faith and learning. But I think even then, the problem is still the same. I don't think that learning can be separate from faith commitments, no matter any kind of learning. I just don't think that's true or possible. I think that anytime you start to even consider questions of learning or education, you are already going to be standing on some key presumptions about learning, and we know this. Take a simple example, the presupposition about whether the world is principally material and only material, and those are the only things we can know or see or touch or handle or know about, or whether in fact our reality consists of both a material side of things but also an immaterial side that's knowable. Well, that is, for most people, that's just a presupposition. That's not something they stood back, considered, reflected, and came to a conclusion. They might reflect on it, but they probably assumed the answer to begin with. Well, that affects everything we do. That simple presupposition really affects everything. And we could multiply examples of faith commitments that presuppose all of our learning and education, no matter what discipline we're in. So I'm not sure it's an integration of faith learning. I think, rather than that, I think learning is an outgrowth of our faith. I think, if anything, we start with faith, and it's just the natural response to our faith commitments, no matter what those are. Second phrase I take issue with is Christian liberal arts. And that's because I think it's a pleonasm. That is to say, it's a phrase that uses more words than it needs. It's redundant because the liberal arts, inasmuch as they really are intended to produce freedom, are Christian. And Christian learning is a liberal arts education, in my view. Secular approaches to the liberal arts, well, let's say that liberal arts is intended not to be, as Aaron pointed out, liberal arts are not there to convey information. That's not what it's about. That's what the sophists were up to. They wanted to give you skills and give you information for some particular end. But the liberal arts were meant to free you and to produce in you true freedom. Freedom from what? All kinds of things. Freedom from conceptual advertising. Freedom from the trickery that comes with clever arguments. So you learn logic and you learn how to think clearly so that you won't be tricked. Freedom from mental and intellectual oppression that comes from without and within. Secular approaches to liberal arts have to be only partially complete because they miss the most important freedom of all, which is the freedom that comes through Jesus Christ. It's the freedom from sin and all the effects of sin, which include not merely our conduct, yes, our conduct, but it includes even our ability to know things. Even the way we interpret the world around us is affected by the pollution of sin and the curse and the fall. And that effect is mitigated not merely by information and skills. In fact, not at all. It's only through the transformation that comes through Jesus Christ. And as Jesus said, if you abide in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. Well, secular liberal arts has nothing to do with that. And so secular liberal arts can't really promise real freedom. They can get you partly there. So that's also why I think liberal arts is, in its fullest sense, liberal arts is Christian liberal arts. So if liberal arts institutions are not merely peddlers of information, we're not just passing on information and skills. For one of the reasons for that is that there's no end to that. There's no end to information. There's no end to the skills you can acquire. Of the reading of books, there is no end. I like to think of that as a little bit of a pun, at least in the English. I have no idea about the Hebrew, but there's no end to it in the sense that there's always going to be more information, there's always going to be more books, but also information itself has no telos. We know all about technology and the idea that technology is not simply neutral. Technology depends on how it is used, the ethical dimension of technology. Well, the same thing with information. Information can be used for this or that end, but the information itself has no end. Both meanings of the sense of end. I think the starting place for the liberal arts, this freedom, is of course, in my view, it's the gospel, and it's the gospel in its fullest sense, as this total, it's what she presented, it's this total political declaration that, in fact, the Lord is king. And as king, he has double ownership of our lives because he made us and because he freed us. For that reason, we owe him total allegiance. And our calling is not just the job we want to do. Our calling begins with God's call. It's called not to a job. Our calling is, we're called to a person. We're called by a person to a person. Our calling is when God says, I have called you by name, you are mine. Well, if that's true, if that's honestly what we believe, God has called us by name and we belong to him. Well, that changes everything. It doesn't change what we add to our education. It changed the very start of education, what it's all about and what it's completely for. And I think that's what a lot of what Daniela was saying far more eloquently. So if we can accept that, and so I remember I wrote some years ago, when I knew even less than I know now about anything, I wrote something for Comment magazine, that Canadian Christian culture journal, magazine, and a friend of mine found out about it and complained, a colleague from New York City, he complained, you wrote for that, I read about them and they support proselytizing, because he read their mission statement, which is something about the kingdom of God or something, and they support proselytizing, and I was reminded that in the eyes of the world, why is that such a dirty thing? Proselytizing. If they're the ones that want to be purveyors of information, why is proselytizing? I think they don't understand it. I think they think that we are in competition in the marketplace of ideas, that Christians are sort of competing in the marketplace of ideas. I think, one, they don't get just how bold Christianity is. I don't think we're competing in the marketplace of ideas. We don't proselytize for the sake of the Christianity, the idea growing. And the reason is, we consider that Jesus Christ rising from the dead, we take to be a historical fact that doesn't depend on anybody believing it or not. Jesus is king by virtue of his commissioning from the Father. The Great Commission happened. The authority was given to him. The kingdoms of this world have become, in fact, the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. And that doesn't depend on us making converts either of our students or of other people. That's not the point of our evangelism and our proselytizing. And so I think that, at a Christian, we're not competing in the marketplace of ideas. We assume the kingdom is God's, and that's the starting place. Given that starting place, we have incredible freedom. And that is one of the great distinctions of a Christian, and I'm using the redundant thing, that's the distinction of a Christian liberal arts education. It starts with freedom and it ends in freedom. Jesus said, I'm the beginning and the end, and I think that's kind of the motto of Christian education. We know that philosophy begins in wonder, but it also ends in wonder. We have a beginning, we have the place of wonder, but we also have an ending. The end of it all is not the information we gain, it's not the skills we acquire. The end, when we keep on pressing, what's the end of it all? It's not a fact, it's not an answer to a question. Jesus is the answer. It's doxology. I think the end of education is it's the worship, it's the adoration. That is a true and meaningful end of education. And I think that's something that secular education can't give. We know that, so philosophy begins in wonder, but philosophy ends in wonder. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, yes, but the fear of the Lord is the end of wisdom. Or knowledge. Daniela talked about time and the consecration of time, and what a vitally important concept for us. But you just take time itself. You know, we're supposed to give a prayer or a devotion at the beginning of our classes, and for some that feels a little bit like a nuisance. For others, that's they can take it overboard, and that's their chance to make sure their students get the gospel. But one thing it does is it consecrates the time. It sets up a liturgical pattern, like Danielle said, of consecrating time. I'm thinking of Augustine, toward the end of the Confessions, when he said, after all this profound reflection, he says, I know what time is, as long as you don't ask me. If you ask me what time is, I don't know. And how true that is. We can't even answer the simplest childlike questions about time, like, is there a past? What kind of existence does the past have? We can't answer that. Does the past actually exist? Well, it existed, but what does that mean? How can it exist if it existed, if it's no longer here? We can't prove that it existed, so we just take that as, we don't know about the future, we can't even answer the simplest questions. And no 2,000 years almost of reflective metaphysics has come up with even a satisfying answer in the slightest. The reflection is worth it, but where does it end up? It ends up where Augustine left it, which is, God is wonderful. It ends up with us receiving time itself as a mystical gift from the Father on high. Now that changes everything about our daily life. It turns our 1 hour class time from, we think of that hour as given to us, it's ours by right, but we also squander it. But if we receive it as a gift from on high, and if in our education, if it's a liturgical pattern that we instill both in our lives and our students, that this hour is a gift from God to be received with gratitude, we don't want to squander it anymore. We want to use it. We want to use it for what it's worth. Our time, we receive now new motivation for our time when we approach education from a Christian perspective. We have motivation for our time. We have all kinds of motivation. Speaking of time, I was meant to try to think of some practical, all this is so philosophical, and I was meant to think of some practical sort of applications. What does this mean day to day? And much of it is attitudinal. It changes our attitudes. Take humility, for example. Christian professors and students at Christian universities ought to be virtuosos in the art of humility, because we know what it means. Paul tells us, consider others more significant than yourselves. Now that doesn't mean false humility. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean Aaron suddenly says, John is probably a better classicist than I. He knows. Well, it would just be downright false, and that's not humility. Nor would it be me recognizing something obvious like, Daniela knows so much more about theology than I do. Well, of course she does. That's not humility. That's just plain truth. So what in the world does humility mean? Well, it's not posturing, we know. It's not appearing humility. In fact, it doesn't appear anything at all. Paul tells us, consider others more significant than yourselves. That's what he says. That's what humility means. Looking to each other's interests as much as to your own. So who's the humblest student in the classroom? Well, we probably wouldn't know because they don't look humble. They're so much spending their time considering others' interests. Now that in itself, just that one principle, if we actually behaved like Christians in that way as faculty, what would we have on our hands? It would be an utter revolution if actually we were looking to the interests of each other as much as we look to our own interests, promoting each other's agendas, promoting each other's work and scholarship instead of trying to showcase ours. It would be an incredible revolution in education. And that's what Christian education is. And so I think our day-to-day task is to work on getting there, to sort of apply these things.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. New faculty, ask your mentors some questions. Let me conclude with this, saying that I appreciate everything that each of you had to offer, especially from these different backgrounds, because we are so quick to say, well, I'm in the College of Ed, we're different than those people, or the history department does this, or we're nursing so they don't understand, or we are music, they don't get it, or I know that some of us even think that we're the only ones that say that. And it's said everywhere across campus, and what's so refreshing about this is to look at that big picture, no matter what the letters are at the end of the diploma, no matter what, when they finish their time here, what is it that we're building? And if we keep that in mind, it sure is refreshing and challenging.